Daniel Hayes was halfway through his usual turkey sandwich when his phone buzzed. The number wasn't saved, just a long, unfamiliar Seattle area code, but something about it made him pause. He wiped his hands on a napkin and picked up. "Mr. Hayes," a clipped, formal voice asked. "This is Allison from Cascade Federal Bank. I'm calling." Daniel blinked. "I don't have a mortgage." A beat of silence. "Sir, records show you're the primary borrower on a home loan issued 3 years ago. The outstanding balance is $417,000, 0 cents. "My rent," Daniel said, his voice tight. "I've never owned a house." The woman didn't flinch. "We have your full name, date of birth, and social security number on file. If this unexpected, I suggest reviewing your credit activity immediately." The call ended politely, efficiently, like nothing was wrong. But everything felt wrong. Daniel sat frozen in the break room, the sandwich now forgotten. His heart thudded in his chest as he pulled up his banking app. His credit score had dropped over 100 points since last month. He stared at the screen, disoriented. It couldn't be real. There had to be a mistake, a system glitch, a fraud alert gone wrong. But the tone of the caller hadn't been vague or phishing-like. It had been certain. A familiar chill ran through him as he realized this wasn't random. Someone had used his information, name, number, social 3 years ago. Whoever did this had been living in the shadow of his name for a long time. Daniel's stomach twisted. He hadn't shared that kind of personal information with anyone except family. His mind flashed to his younger brother Tyler, the one who talked about buying a place he couldn't afford. The same brother their parents always bailed out. Daniel swallowed hard. The idea was too awful to fully believe, but too specific to ignore. He stood from the table, barely noticing as his chair scraped loudly against the tile. His lunch hour was over. His normal life might be too. Daniel rushed back to his apartment after work, the call still echoing in his head. The moment he stepped inside, he dropped his bag and went straight to his filing cabinet. Bank statements, tax returns, student loan records, all neat, all untouched by anything resembling a mortgage. He flipped through folders with shaking hands, searching for any possible clue that this was just a clerical error. Nothing. No paperwork, no late notices, no loan documents. His name was clean, or so he thought. Next, he logged into a free credit monitoring service. It took less than a minute to confirm what the caller had said. A 30-year mortgage, opened in his name 3 years ago with Cascade Federal, late payments noted in the past few months. His jaw clenched as he scrolled through the details. The loan address was a house he'd never seen, in a neighborhood he'd never visited, but the social security number, the birth date, the signature, at least it looked like his. He stood up too fast, the room tilting slightly as the realization hit. This wasn't just some scam from across the globe. This was personal. Someone who had access, someone who knew enough to forge a near-perfect version of his signature. His chest tightened with a feeling that was heavier than fear. Betrayal. The quiet kind that doesn't explode, but burrows deep, turning everything familiar into something sharp. Daniel sank onto his couch, his mind racing. It had to be Tyler. No one else had enough of his information. And Tyler, with his half-baked business ideas and chronic need for a little help, had always been reckless. But this was another level. And the worst part? His parents probably knew, maybe even justified it. After all, he was the stable one, the one who wouldn't mind, but he did. He minded more than he'd, and for the first time, he couldn't brush it off. This wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. Daniel sat in the dim light of his apartment, the glow from his laptop casting long shadows on the wall. His thoughts spiraled, cycling through conversations he hadn't thought twice about until now. Tyler had joked about credit scores at Thanksgiving, waving his phone around like it was a trophy. "Yours is golden, man. I bet you could buy a mansion if you wanted to." At the time, Daniel had just rolled his eyes. Now those words hit differently. Tyler had always been reckless with money, flashing cash one week, begging their parents for help the next. And growing up, it was always Daniel who got the lecture about responsibility, while Tyler got excuses. He's just finding his path, their mom would say. You're the steady one, their dad would add. Daniel was the net that caught everything: late bills, broken promises, tension at family gatherings. But none of that had prepared him for the idea that his own brother, blood and all, had forged his name onto a mortgage and walked away as if it didn't matter. The more Daniel thought about it, the more memories bubbled to the surface. Tyler showing him listings on his phone, talking about manifesting a bigger life, their parents nodding along. Daniel had dismissed it as Tyler's usual talk, but maybe it wasn't just talk. Maybe Tyler was laying the groundwork, testing how close he could get to the edge, and now Daniel saw it clearly. He hadn't just been the fallback, the dependable one. He'd been the tool someone Tyler could use without asking, knowing Daniel wouldn't make a scene, wouldn't fight back. But something had changed. The weight of it settled in Daniel's chest like a steel plate. This wasn't just about a loan. It was about every time they'd asked him to be smaller so Tyler could feel bigger. Every time they'd assumed he would understand, absorb, endure. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was personal. And for the first time, Daniel didn't feel like cleaning up the mess. He felt like burning it down. The next morning, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, bleary-eyed from a sleepless night. His laptop was open, tabs scattered across the screen, identity theft resources, mortgage fraud articles, legal advice forums. None of it made the reality feel any less surreal. With a deep breath, he called the number from the day before and asked for a full copy of the loan documents. The woman on the phone was polite. Within minutes, a PDF arrived in his inbox. Daniel opened it with shaking hands. Page after page filled the screen, his name at the top, his address from years ago listed as current, and most damning of all, his signature. Except it wasn't, not really. It looked close enough to pass under casual scrutiny, but Daniel knew better. The curve of the D was wrong. The slant of the S in haze, too clean. He zoomed in, examining the lines like they were a fingerprint. It was like looking at a mirror image that didn't quite reflect. His chest tightened. This wasn't a prank. This was real. And whoever had signed this hadn't just guessed. This was someone who had watched him sign things before. Someone who had access to his handwriting, his personal details, even his tone. Daniel clicked through every page, noting every forged initial, every box checked, every lie printed in black and white. The more he saw, the angrier he became, not just at Tyler, but at himself, for trusting, for being predictable, for assuming his boundaries would be respected just because they were family. He closed the laptop, eyes burning. If they thought he'd stay quiet, they didn't know him at all. The old version of him might have. Sunday came faster than Daniel expected. He almost didn't go. He stood outside his parents' suburban house, staring at the familiar front door like it was the entrance to a trial. The porch light flickered overhead, casting a jittery shadow on the steps. For a moment, he considered walking away, pretending. But no, this time he wasn't there to keep the peace. He rang the bell once, then again. His mom answered with a smile like nothing was wrong. Danny, right on time. Come in, sweetheart. He stepped inside without returning the smile, his jaw tight. Dinner was exactly as it had always been. Too much food, forced conversation, and all attention orbiting Tyler. He was sprawled across the end of the couch, new sneakers on his feet, talking about how hard it was to find reliable contractors for the house. Can you believe the landscaper tried to charge me for mulch delivery? He laughed. Their mom chuckled along, doting on him like he was made of gold. Their dad offered a grunt of agreement between sips of beer. Daniel sat stiffly, waiting, watching, letting it all unravel on its own. After the table was cleared, he spoke. "I have a question," he said, voice low and calm. 3 sets of eyes turned toward him, still casual, still clueless. "Does anyone know anything about a mortgage in my name?" The silence that followed was instant and deafening. Tyler's face froze. Their mother's fork hovered in midair. Their dad suddenly found something interesting in his mashed potatoes. It was the kind of silence that doesn't ask for clarification. It confirms everything. Daniel didn't blink. His mother was the first to recover. "Honey," she said gently, like he'd asked something silly. "It's just paperwork. Tyler needed a little help qualifying. It's not like you're actually paying for it." Tyler chimed in, defensive. "You have great credit. I don't. It was just a formality. I figured you'd understand." Daniel leaned back, absorbing the words. Formally accused, casually explained, like they were talking about borrowing a sweater, not a 6-figure fraud, not the theft of his future. The room blurred around the edges, but his voice stayed steady. "Thanks for explaining," he said, pushing his chair back. They visibly relaxed, mistaking his calm for compliance, but inside, something had cracked and shifted permanently. They thought this was done now, that he'd forgive, forget, and fall back into his quiet role. But they were wrong. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't arguing, not yet. What was coming wouldn't be loud. It would be deliberate, documented, and final. As he stood to leave, he made a silent promise to himself. This time, he wouldn't let it slide. Back in his apartment, Daniel didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the dark, the glow from the street outside spilling across the floor, like a reminder that the world hadn't stopped just because his did. The quiet felt heavier than usual, thick with the realization that his family hadn't made a mistake. They'd made a decision. They'd stolen from him because they assumed he wouldn't fight back, and for most of his life, that would have been true. He'd always played the role, steady, quiet, reliable. But something about this broke the script. He moved methodically now, opening drawers, pulling folders from shelves, bank statements, pay stubs, his birth certificate, old emails from Tyler, anything that hinted at a connection to the mortgage. He wasn't even sure what he'd need, but he was building something: proof, protection, ammunition. Every page he stamped onto the kitchen table felt like a step away from who he'd been and towards someone new. Someone who drew a hard line. There was no anger in him, not the kind that screams. It was something colder, sharper, clarity. They'd counted on his silence, and they were about to find out what it cost to underestimate him. He looked down at the growing pile of paperwork. It wasn't just evidence, it was a boundary, a declaration, a map out of the wreckage. He didn't know exactly what came next, but he was done being the safety net. The following morning, Daniel sat in a quiet corner of a downtown cafe, a black coffee cooling in front of him. He hadn't touched it. His laptop bag sat on the chair beside him, stuffed with carefully organized documents. At exactly 9:00 a.m., a tall man in a charcoal blazer walked in and introduced himself as Mark Collins, a real estate and fraud attorney recommended by one of Daniel's old coworkers. Collins looked like he hadn't lost a case in years and didn't plan on starting now. Daniel shook his hand, grateful to see someone who didn't flinch when the word family and fraud appeared in the same sentence. They got to work immediately. Daniel laid out everything: printouts of the mortgage, credit reports, his ID, old messages from Tyler. Collins flipped through each sheet slowly, occasionally pausing to scribble notes. "You understand what this means?" he asked after a few minutes. "This isn't just identity theft. It's mortgage fraud, and it's criminal. You're not liable, but we have to act fast." Daniel nodded, his jaw clenched. The words didn't scare him. They steadied him. For once, someone was calling it what it was. Collins outlined the next steps with mechanical precision. File a police report, notify the bank in writing with the report attached, formally dispute the loan, and prepare to sue for damages if needed. It won't be easy, Collins warned, and it might destroy whatever relationship you've got left with your family. Daniel didn't hesitate. There's not much left to destroy. That was the part his family didn't understand. This wasn't revenge. It was survival. By the time their meeting ended, Daniel had a plan, a folder of legal forms, and the number of a credit monitoring service Collins trusted. As they shook hands, Collins looked him in the eye. You're doing the right thing. Don't let guilt make you soft. Daniel nodded, tucking the lawyer's card into his wallet. As he stepped outside into the cold sunlight, the weight on his shoulders hadn't vanished, but now it had structure, direction. For the first time since that phone call, he felt like he wasn't drowning. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was taking back control. The police station smelled faintly of old coffee and paperwork. Daniel stood at the front desk, a manila folder tucked tightly under his arm, the edges slightly bent from his grip. When the officer asked what he needed, Daniel didn't stumble. I need to file a report for identity theft and mortgage fraud, he said. The officer raised an eyebrow, but nodded, motioning him to a side room. There, Daniel laid everything out. His ID, credit report, the forged mortgage papers, and a timeline of how he discovered it. The officer reviewed the documents in silence, his expression shifting to quiet disbelief. You sure you want to move forward with this? The officer asked, glancing up. It wasn't doubt, it was a warning about what it would mean. Daniel didn't hesitate. If I don't, they'll keep taking from me. The words felt solid in his mouth, like they belonged there. The officer nodded, stamped the paperwork, and handed Daniel a copy of the report. It was official now. No more gray area, no more pretending it might blow over. He was in it. That same afternoon, Daniel went to the post office and mailed a certified letter to Cascade Federal Bank. Inside, a copy of the police report, a formal dispute notice, and a short, steady cover letter written with Collins' help. As he signed the form at the counter, his hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the finality. There would be no undoing this, and that, for the first time, felt like a good thing. The silence didn't last long. 3 days after mailing the dispute letter, Daniel's phone lit up with a string of missed calls. His mother, then Tyler, then his father. He didn't answer. Voicemails piled up, some pleading, some angry, all laced with the same message. How could he? They talked about family, about loyalty, about how he was making things worse. Tyler's voice cracked in one message, claiming it had all been a misunderstanding and that he'd make it right. But Daniel knew better. This wasn't about fixing anything. It was about losing control of him, of the safety he represented. His mother finally showed up at his apartment one evening, unannounced. He watched her from the window before opening the door, taking in her furious expression and the tightly clenched purse in her hands. She didn't say, "Hello, how dare you involve the police?" she hissed, voice shaking more with fear than rage. "Do you know what you've done to this family?" Daniel didn't flinch. He let her talk about betrayal, about shame, about the cost of legal trouble. He said nothing until she stopped long enough to breathe. Then, with quiet finality, he said, "Family asks, they don't steal." He didn't invite her in. He didn't argue. He just closed the door. The soft click of the latch was louder than any shouting match could have been. Behind it, he leaned against the wall, heart pounding, not with regret, but release. For the first time, he hadn't explained himself, and that silence felt like power. In the days that followed, the noise died down. The calls stopped. No more surprise visits. No more guilt-laced messages from relatives begging him to be the bigger person. For the first time in years, Daniel experienced quiet. Not the kind that isolates, but the kind that frees. He realized how much space guilt had taken up in his life. How often he'd stepped aside so Tyler could feel tall. With that silence came clarity. He didn't owe them his peace just because they shared his blood. He started doing things he hadn't made time for in years. Saturday mornings became quiet rituals. Farmers markets, long walks through Discovery Park, coffee without deadlines. He signed up for a pottery class at a studio near his apartment. At first, his hands were clumsy, the clay uncooperative, but with each week, it got easier. There was something grounding about shaping something from scratch. It wasn't about being good. It was about doing something for himself without expectation or judgment. The legal case still moved in the background. Meals from Collins, updates from the bank, paperwork to sign, but it no longer consumed him. What had once felt like an emergency now felt like a process, something necessary, something he could manage. The deeper shift wasn't just in his circumstances, it was in his identity. Daniel had spent years being the version of himself his family relied on. Now he was building something different, a life that didn't orbit around their needs, their drama, or their approval, a life that finally felt like it was his. Nearly a year later, Daniel returned from a weekend pottery fair, arms full of mugs and bowls. When he saw them, his parents and Tyler standing outside his apartment building. They looked smaller than he remembered. Tyler's clothes hung looser, his hair unkempt. His mother clutched her purse like it was armor, and his father stood behind them, silent, not meeting Daniel's eyes. The house Tyler had once bragged about was gone, foreclosed. The bank's investigation had done its work. Their illusion of control had cracked, and now here they were, not to reconnect, but to reclaim.
"Daniel,"
his mother began, voice trembling. "We made a mistake, but we're still family." Tyler stepped forward, desperation leaking from his posture. "I just need help, just for a little while, please." The words were familiar, like old echoes. Daniel set down his bags carefully and looked at them. For the first time, he didn't feel anger. He didn't feel hurt, just clarity. They weren't here because they saw him. They were here because they needed something from him again. "I hope one day you understand what real family means," Daniel said, his voice calm. "But it's not something you can fake or steal or ask for, only when it's convenient." Then he picked up his bags and walked past them. No shouting, no parting insults, just quiet, certain distance. As he reached the stairs, the late afternoon breeze caught his jacket. He paused, then whispered to himself, "Sometimes walking away is the loudest thing." Weeks passed, and the silence remained. No more calls, no more knocks at his door. Daniel had become a ghost in the world of people who once expected him to be their foundation. At first, the quiet was strange, an emptiness that felt too wide, too still. But slowly, it began to feel like peace. He filled his days with things that didn't ask anything from him. Long walks, dinners alone by candlelight, and hours spent at the pottery wheel. Life didn't feel like recovery anymore. It felt like creation. The legal process continued to unfold in the background. Collins kept him updated as the loan was formally removed from his record. The bank issued an apology, and Tyler's name was now the only one left to answer for the debt. There was still paperwork, still steps to finish, but the weight on Daniel's chest had lifted. Each letter addressed to Daniel Hayes reminded him, "This name is mine again, not borrowed, not misused, his." One quiet evening, he sat on his balcony, a cup of tea in hand, watching the city lights blink to life in the distance. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want his family to suffer. He just wanted distance. And now he had it. He thought about the version of himself who always said yes, always carried the weight. That version was gone, replaced by someone steady, quiet, and unshakably free. He smiled softly into the darkness and whispered the words he'd waited his whole life to believe. "I owe them nothing." Daniel's story is a quiet but powerful reminder. Boundaries are not betrayal, they're survival. Too often, we're taught that family loyalty means silence, sacrifice, and staying small. But real love doesn't steal. It doesn't exploit trust or assume compliance. Daniel learned that protecting his future meant standing up, speaking out, and letting go. And in doing so, he reclaimed more than just his credit. The biggest shift wasn't external. It was internal. He stopped being the fixer, the fallback, the silent one. He became whole on his own terms. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt used, unseen, or taken for granted, know this. You're allowed to draw the line. You're allowed to choose yourself. If you found value in this story, like it to support more content like this, subscribe for deeper storytelling with real impact, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Because sometimes the quietest people have the loudest truth, and the most powerful stories deserve to be heard.